You know, the name of the show that we have here is called Remix. But before you can remix, you have to mix. And what I want to do is, before I talk about what I have in there about remix, I want to talk a little bit about mix. Because, you know, when you use the term remix, and especially in our culture, when you are using mainstream and then you see African American artists who look at these items and remix them, it kind of leaves the impression that they started it and we took it and remixed it. And that's really not the case at all. And it's easy to get that impression because of where we live and because of the history of African Americans in this country. That is certainly not the case. Remixing and mixing is what art is all about. It's been that way. It's been that way in music. It's been that way. If there were no African, you could take a show with no African Americans in it and call it remix of just other people, because it's always that way. It's always that way. Picasso said, I steal a lot. You know, and you see something and you just take it and you use part of it. In the music industry, they're sampling all the time. That's remixing. But before you can remix, you got to mix. So I want to show you something about mixing. I want to show you this because in the arts, for a long time, when you look at a painting, you look through a window. And you look through a window, it's got perspective, and so you see like that. You know, some of the larger things are at the front, smaller things, gradations, until they get to the back. So you're looking at a window. And then about the 1900s, artists started experimenting with other ways of doing things. Instead of creating a window, and you look at art that way, they created the surface where you look across the surface of the painting, and with the surface of painting, you see things going in, things going out, so they're modulating the surface, so you've got a very interesting pattern on the surface itself. What happens is that when you use bright colors, it seems to come toward you. You use grayed colors, it seems to go away from you. And so when you put these colors next to each other, you get this modulation. So they started looking at that. Picasso did. And where did he find inspiration for that? In Africa. You know, look at the faces here. And this is a face that Picasso did in one of his paintings. This is one of his famous paintings, the Zenzel. And if you notice, he has these faces here. Now, this isn't remix. This is simply mixing. He's simply taking these objects and mixing them in. And in fact, when he did this, he kept this under the bed for almost 4 years. Didn't even show it to anybody because it was so different and so radically different. And here you see a portrait of him, and then you see what's going on. Now, what's happened is, if you notice the plane. There's one plane, there's another plane, there's one plane, there's another plane. And that's the same thing that Africans were doing in their sculpture. They were showing profiles and frontal views and using and taking the face and changing the face so that the face was not rounded as we see it. But they weren't doing it because they were thinking about art. It's a part of their utilitarian culture. You know, in Africa, these were objects for rituals and things like that. It's a part of their custom. It's in the West that we turn it into what we call a non-essential aesthetic. We take it out of that context and put it in the museum with these nice white walls and say, boy, this is some great stuff. When the Africans come in and say, what are you doing with my stuff? Because what happens is when you put a reed and raffia around this thing and turn the lights down low and the music and the drums start, these things take on magical powers. But when we get them, we just look at these art objects and say, wow, this is some great stuff. And that's what Picasso did. You know, he saw these things in the museum. He said, boy, this is the ideas that I've been thinking about in my painting. But the Africans weren't painting. They were using sculpture. So they were looking at the sculpture and translating those sculptures, those forms, as you see here, translating those plain forms, those patterns, the way they used the phone, translated that. Cézanne, and then eventually Braque, and then Picasso, and then from that became the first really contemporary art movement called Cubism, and then Surrealism, and then it went from that. So you see, that's a part of the mix. Now, this, of course, is a flag, and this is by Jasper Johns, a homeboy. He's from here too. But if you look at this flag, you notice how he does the flag. These are 3 flags, and they were done at different times, but he put them together. And when he put them together, notice he put them together so that one flag is on top of another flag on top of, and it looks like it's coming out toward you. Or you can look at it and look like it's going in. So he's creating this push and pull right on the surface. And that's a very contemporary thing, because you don't know whether it's that way or whether it's this way. So what he's doing is creating a push-pull with this, but it's a flag. You know what he said about his painting? He said, what I want to do is I want to force you to see something that you're seeing all the time in a different way. See, art is a way of making you seeing something you see ordinarily in a very different way. And certainly you've never seen the flag like this. So you see, he had an idea behind what he was doing. Now, this is, some people call it a target. It's just a circular form. I like the circle because you can't look anyplace else. It's right there. Bam. This is Kenneth Nolan. And this has got color. He did many of these things in different colors. So it's not targeted. It's just a circular form. Johns did some targets, and he had people there. And his ideas of what he wanted to use the target for is the same as the painting. What he's doing is creating these images so that you look at the surface. He used encaustic, and encaustic is a very rich surface. Now, this is one of my flags, and it's not an American flag, but the idea for the flag that I paint is not altogether different. I wanted to take a Confederate flag and paint it as if 120 years, 150 years later, you pull it out of a trunk and you look at it, and it would be tattered and blood-stained, and half of it would be gone. And it would be a relic. It would be something that you would hold on to, because you don't want to fly this thing that your grandfather had on top of a state house. And this is the flag of the Confederacy. This is the flag that's gone with the wind. And so what you see flying around, these polyester and cotton things, is not the flag. It is an ideological image for an attitude. And so all of my flags have certain things. Among them is, you notice sometimes the stars at the end, they're tattered at the end. I like to create a texture in them so that you can see the kind of deterioration of it. It's not to dishonor it, but it's to put it in its proper context. This is another one called Cotton Flag. Greenville Museum has this piece. And again, here it's devoid of color. Because I think if you change the way you look at something, the thing you look at will change. So I've just taken it and made it another color. And this is one of my targets. Now, I didn't paint this target as a target. I'm going to show you the whole idea, if you notice, in this, is that it looks like it's splattered and the bullet holes in it and all of that. My idea of a target was for this. This is the part of that. There's a figure behind there. And these series are not called targets. They're called Targeted Man. And they were inspired by growing up in a little town called St. Stephen's in South Carolina, Berkeley County, 45 miles north of Charleston, and seeing the Ku Klux Klan have their rallies And when they have their rallies, what they would do is do it at night when it's all dark and white sheets, and they knew black folk would be intimidated by that. And they'd run in the house and bombs said, come in, let's close the door. They're having a rally tonight. And then afterward, next day, it would all be gone. They'd burn their crosses, and you didn't know who they were. They could be people you working for. You didn't know who they were. My brother was working for a guy, and he was in the truck, and he was taking him someplace, and she said, look under that seat and get that thing. And he looked under there and pulled out this hood. He said, oh, put that back. We didn't know who he was. He was somebody who we knew all the time. And so nobody used the term terrorist then. And then 9/11 came. And when 9/11 came, that fear that we had locking up with that cross burning in the woods gripped the nation. And right now, it is that fear because we feel targeted. Every time if we were to hear a loud boom right now, the first thing somebody will say, terrorist. You don't know. And that's the whole idea behind my Targeted Man series. For instance, targeted man emerging. Somebody just in the shadows, you don't know who he is. Just because he has a target on doesn't mean that he's not targeting you. Because what they do is they wear these belts and blow themselves up. So they could be the target, but you could be the target too. So what I try to do is explore that sinister nature, that uneasiness, that not knowing. Notice they always wear something where you can't see their faces. The fellow that got away recently in Belgium had a light coat on and a hat. You don't know where they are. You don't know who they are. And so because you don't know, it breeds a kind of prejudice because they come from a certain place in the world, and so you say they're all the same. Because you can't see their faces, you don't know who they are. But we were targeted too, and we still are. And so if you notice, there's a target, there's a figure, but also there is the X. And that X is from the flag. It just evolved to that. You know, as an artist, what you have to do is you have to arrive at a place. You know, people don't understand. You can't go there. You have to arrive there. And arrive there might take a lot of years. For me, I started painting flags, and then I started doing the targets, and then all of a sudden, I just realized that the flag with this X marks the spot. X can mean that you X'd out. X means that you're excluded. X means that that's not the place to go. They put X's on houses when you say they don't want you to go into houses again. But then I found out that they use that same thing on railroad tracks, the same proportion as you see in the flag. And a railroad crossing is something that in my hometown, the railroad track ran down through the middle of town, and they would come sometimes in the middle of Saturday evening. And on Saturday evening, everybody comes from the country and downtown shopping. But when that train comes by, you have to wait 30 minutes to get on the other side of the track. It was a crossing. But then I thought, you know, in life, there are crossings. We all have these crossings that we have to do. We have to cross over. We lose a loved one. We have to cross over that. Lose a husband. We have to cross over that. Just things in our life. Bad son, bad daughter-in-law, ugly mother-in-law. We have to cross over all of those things. And then one day I went to a funeral of my colleague, Barbara. And it was a Presbyterian church, and they said, Barbara has died, and she has made the final crossing. And then he recited Tennyson, Crossing the Bar. And then I realized that that's what life is all about. So the Confederate thing is something that we have to cross over. we as a nation have to cross over that. And so what I've done is sometimes I use the cross that you see, and then I use the X here, the cross, then the target, and then a figure. This was done after the Trayvon Martin thing. Because sometimes when you put over the hood, and they just become anonymous people. We read about them every day, somebody getting shot. This is one that the museum, McKissick's has. Jane isn't here today, but you can tell Jane we had it up. This is called Targeted Man Standing. And I just believe that, folk walk around and they're targeted. They're just targeted. They don't know it, but they're targeted. Things happen to them. They don't know why they happen, but they're targeted. And this brings me now to the Mother Emmanuel Church. I did this first and sent it to my gallery, and she sold it before it even got there. Somebody just said, I have one of his paintings. Has he done anything about Mother Emmanuel? She says, she just sent one to her, and they just bought it. So the feeling, the whole idea of that stuck with me. And from there, I painted another one. This was number 2. And when the Mother Emmanuel thing happened, what's amazing is that there are friends from all over the country who knew my work and called me and said, oh, it's your time now. It's coming back. You did those flags. Look, it's your time now. Well, it's not my time. It's their time for healing. So I didn't even have any shows during that time, but I still worked because it was a very moving experience for me. And so in this one, I simply put that, and always the background of the church and the flag, and then the number 9. If you look around it, you can see these little X's of people being X'd out. When you paint stuff about stuff like this, there was always the tendency to paint in anger, but you can't do that. There's always a tendency to paint and make it so local that it has no power beyond the moment, and you can't do that. The Guernica, Picasso painted the Guernica, this big painting about a wall, a Spanish wall, and it still resonates today because it's not just about the Spanish wall, it's about war in general. So I would hope that in years to come, people who would not even know about the Mother Emmanuel event would see a church and see a flag that is bloodied and see the figure 9 and say, something must have happened there. They might not know. They say, something must have happened there in a church. And so when you're working in art, you should always think about something more than just the event. I think you have to be larger than the event. The event should be what starts you off, but you don't live in that. And this is the one that kind of started off some things that are happening right now. Jennifer Whittle, who lives in Greenville and was on the board of Spoleto, and Spoleto each year has an auction, and she asked me to enter something in the auction. She said, because I don't do auctions. You do auctions, they sell it for a lower price, and your gallery get mad because they say, how are you going to let somebody buy it, that, and so I just don't do them. I'd rather make a contribution. But she said, oh, I see what else they have, but you got to be there. You got to do something. I just have to have one of your works. She didn't say anything about Mother Emmanuel. I just happened to have the smaller piece of that, and she wanted it immediately. So I said, okay, Jennifer, because we are great friends, I'll let you have it. And she took it down there. When she took it down there, I think I put, $6,000 on it or something. Anyway, she called me back about 2 days later and said, somebody offered $14,500 for the work, and they won't sell it because they said that they want to wait for the auction. I said, you tell them to take that money. Well, anyway, They made a lot of money. I didn't get a dime, but they made a lot of money off. But it was so moving, and they got so much time, so much talk about it, until they got together and decided for me to do 9 paintings. And that's tough because it just has it's a lot of work. This was number 3, but I thought 9 paintings, and they have even secured a place now at the Riverfront Gallery in Charleston where they're going to use the whole first floor, and just do the 9 paintings there and have it a kind of tribute and do a video and all of that. And so here I am working. Had to do my income tax and take a break and had to work. But the 9 is what really sold this for me. So I've been doing that, and they have been really very, very kind. So far, I have got 6. I'm working on the 6th one now. Don't tell my gallery director; she'll be coming to pick them up. And this is targeted man running. And I don't have to tell you what this comes from, but targeted man running. You saw a targeted man standing. This is a much more recent targeted man running. The thing that I think you should think about is, more than anything else, is both of these works, everything you've seen so far, comes out of what I've been doing all the time. I've been doing flags since 1971, after I got back to the University of Georgia. I've been doing targets since about 94 or something like that. So what happens is this just fitted into what I was doing all the time. And that's what I mean by arriving there. And there's a difference between going there and arriving there. When you arrive there, it's an adventure. You go through many places, many turns, and then you arrive at this place. When you go there, you know where you're going, and you just go there. Nothing happens along the way. And it is the stuff that happens along the way that makes it worthwhile. And this is the piece that you have here. Now, let me tell you about these kinds of shows, because it's so important. You know, the Columbia Museum was a special place for me because I remember back when I got at University of Georgia, about 1971 or so, Jack Kraft, who's director of the Columbia Museum all on Taylor Street over there, asked me to speak to the Southeastern Museum Association. That's museum directors from Alabama, about 10 states. It's an affiliate of the American Museum Association. So here I was, green as grass, coming in, talking to them. I was the only black guy in the room. They all over them. They were waiting to see what I was going to say. And what I said, in the 25-year history of this museum, they've never had a one-man show by a black person. And I saw one of the museum directors in the black look out from Greenville. I won't tell you who he is. He jumped up and he walked out of the room. And I think he walked out of the room because he was doing some research. Because he's the kind of guy who would really challenge you. And then he came back quietly and sat down. Because I knew he didn't find anything. I said that if you take 25 white balls and 1 black ball and you put them in a bowl with 1 hole in the middle and you shake it every day for 25 years, the black ball will fall out at least 1 time. I said, so it's not an omission. It's not an omission. You're just ignoring it. And eventually, that speech was published in the museum news, the museum, the American Museum Association annual publication. But it was a great piece, and how things have changed. How they're collecting more African American art. Museums are learning that African American art is American art, and you can't tell the story about America without telling the story of African Americans here. But you know, in the beginning, this is the way African Americans began to get into the mainstream of museums. Museum had survey shows. You know what a survey show is? They pick African Americans, several African American artists, and they take the African American artists, about, to say, 20, 25. Each of them has one work, and they have these shows, African American art today. And when you do that, what I said to them was that when you do that, what you're doing is looking at an artist through a keyhole. You're not really seeing, because he picks the work, or they have a juror, and the juror picks the work, and you're looking at just that one thing. Well, that's what's happening in remix. But there's a reason for that. What it does is introduce you to artists, and hopefully you'll say, gee, I want to see more of that artist's work. Or maybe it says, as Bing said in his opening, that you'll see an artist in there, we need to get a one-person show by this artist. So when you go in there, look at it and say, who in here we'd like to see more of, and then ask, why don't we get a one-person show by these artists? Because you see, that's the reason I showed you all those pictures of what I did before I showed you this. Because there's a whole new world out there about artists, these artists that you don't know. The turning point in my career was when the University of Georgia and the Georgia Museum of Art had a retrospective of my work. Oh, I had big shows all over, but they did a retrospective, and people came in there, and it changed my career. They saw something that they had not seen before, and I'm still grateful for that. And they did it right. You know, sometimes when they do a retrospective, you know, they do little things. The Georgia Museum had a curator who worked on it for 2 years, putting it together. And when it was put together, it traveled for another 2 years, or 3 years, something like that. But that's what's important. Now let me end by telling you this. Ralph Ellison said something that I think is so important. And that is important, especially when you look at these shows. Because just because you remix something, just because you look at something and you sample it, just because I look at a flag and say, I'm going to paint that flag my way, I don't give up what I have. I don't give up my stuff. What I do is take some of your stuff and put it with my stuff, and I create some stuff. And so Ellison put it in great terms when he said, if you can show me how I can become a part of your world without losing that which is uniquely my own, then I will not only sing your praises, but I will help the desert bear fruit. Thank you.